6 Marines raised the Stars and Stripes atop Mount Suribachi in Iwo Jima. It's the first time the US flag has flown on Japanese soil. 2 days later, the triumphant image adorns the front covers of newspapers across the US. It becomes one of the defining images of America's war. But what this famous image hides is the true cost of the battle for this tiny island.
It's an absolute horror show that the Marines have just got to endure as best they can.
In the first 48 hours of combat, over 3,500 Marines are killed and wounded.
Losses that were so heavy and so unexpected for such a relatively insignificant place that Roosevelt, when he heard of it, he wept.
What the American public doesn't know is that the slaughter is only just beginning.
The Japanese objective was to make the Americans pay as much as possible in blood and time.
The battle for the 8-mile square rock becomes the bloodiest in Marine history.
For every inch of that island, they had lost a soldier.
As it wades in the blood of Iwo Jima, America risks losing another battle. The battle for hearts and minds back home.
Why are we losing all these people on this godforsaken island?
A squadron of giant US B-29 bombers is being prepared for a vital mission, a strike on the Japanese capital, Tokyo. The Army Air Forces boast that the superfortress, as the B-29 is known, is the nearest thing to an irresistible force ever devised.
The B-29 was not really state-of-the-art. It was ahead of the state-of-the-art.
It had pressurized cabins, so it could fly much higher than any plane had ever done before. It was very fast. It could go up to 400 miles an hour.
Carried, of course, a heavier bomb load and had more endurance, longer range.
From US bases in Guam and Saipan, the superforts can fly the 1,500 miles to the Japanese capital and back without needing to refuel.
It was a real game changer in the sense that it finally brought the home islands into range of American bombing.
But the most potent bombers of World War II have a big problem.
B-29 bombers from Saipan and Guam needed fighter protection in their air raids over Japan. No fighter could fly all the way from Saipan to Tokyo.
Based on bitter experience in Europe and in the Pacific by 1944, that if you're going to conduct a strategic bombing campaign, you want the bombers to be escorted by fighter aircraft.
The Army Air Forces argue there's a simple solution: to take the Japanese island of Iwo Jima.
It's right smack in the middle of the transit route for all of the American bombers that are going back and forth between Marianas and Japan.
The 8-mile square island is now the first line of defense against the Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands.
They put air defense radars there. They have 3 airstrips on the island to scramble fighters against the B-29s coming from the Marianas.
Japanese aircraft stationed in Iwo Jima are also launching retaliatory strikes against the American base in Saipan. Raids have destroyed 11 B-29s and badly damaged 8 more. Losing these aircraft is an expensive business.
The total cost of the development of the superfortress was $3 billion. That's $1 billion more than it costs to develop atomic weapons.
To get that much money, you've got to show some really significant results.
General Henry Hap Arnold, the head of the US Army Air Forces, believes the B-29s can bring Japan to its knees.
No part of the Japanese Empire is now out of our range. No war factor too remote to feel our bombs. The battle for Japan is now underway with full speed ahead.
He's trying to demonstrate that strategic bombing can produce strategic results and actually end this war without an invasion.
For Arnold, there's even more at stake. He wants to free the Air Force from the Army's control.
They see themselves as being the supreme service. They think air power is going to be the most important aspect of future warfare.
The B-29 campaign against Japan would be sort of the closing argument on their right to be an independent service.
Air forces convinced the Allies that the seizure of Iwo Jima was necessary to provide fighter support for the bombing raids. The Allied campaign in the Pacific was a two-pronged thrust across the Pacific, one coming out from the south, from Australia along New Guinea to the Philippines, and the other an island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific.
By late summer 1944, Admiral Chester Nimitz's naval force has liberated the Mariana Islands of Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. Now, Nimitz has Iwo Jima in his sights. Recent battles have been bloody, but Iwo Jima is likely to be an even tougher challenge.
It was not like other islands like Saipan or Marianas and Marshalls. Those were almost like a colonial gains Japan got after World War I. But Iwo Jima was part of Japan proper.
There's no civilian population there. Every single person on that island is a Japanese soldier intending to sell it dearly with his life.
If military could not defend a home island, that would be really bad news to, war efforts.
In November 1944, the US begins an air assault on Iwo Jima that lasts over 2 months.
It was important to neutralize as much as possible the defensive force ashore.
On the 16th of February 1945, the battle fleet enters the fray.
The big battleships and heavy cruisers lobbed 14-inch, 8-inch, and even 5-inch shells into any place that looked like it might be fortified.
Planes from the Navy's aircraft carrier force join the party, bombing and strafing the island.
That included into the flanks of Mount Suribachi and the air bases, which were the critical, of course, and the main reason to seize the island.
Gunboats move in to work over enemy beach installations.
The typical pattern has been that the Japanese would put their defenses right on the beach where we can get at them with naval gunfire.
In previous campaigns, there had been an absolute bloodbath on the beaches when they first landed.
To avoid a repeat, the Marines request 10 days of naval bombardment.
We should be able to basically vaporize those defenses at the water's edge and allow the Marines to come ashore relatively easily.
But aerial reconnaissance has identified few obvious targets. And much to the Marines' dismay, the Navy only grants them a 3-day barrage.
The Navy said you can't win this with naval gunfire support. You have to win it on the ground.
They don't anticipate that there's going to be a lot of resistance at all.
The estimate going into the operation is there are only like 10,000 or so Japanese on the island.
In July 1944, when the Marines invaded Tinian in the Marianas, they eliminated the 8,000-strong garrison in less than a week.
We killed most of them and only lost less than 400 Americans. So if you have that in the back of your mind that, well, it's not going to be pleasant, but it's going to be doable and the casualties are going to be reasonable.
"80,000 Marines are now ready and waiting to take Iwo Jima.
Given the number of troops the Americans were planning to put on Iwo Jima and the size of the island, there was an assumption it would just take a matter of days to actually complete the operation.
Watching from the bridge of Vice Admiral Kelly Turner's flagship is Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal. Forrestal sees the invasion as an unmissable PR opportunity.
When James Forrestal became Secretary of the Navy in April of 1944, one of his biggest issues was that the Navy, in his view, was losing the public relations battle. They were not being adequately forthcoming with the press.
At Iwo Jima, over 50 war correspondents are given unprecedented access.
Iwo Jima was obviously going to be a spectacular operation. 3 Marine divisions, a huge fleet. It was one of the biggest operations the Navy had conducted under Navy command during the war.
26 combat cameramen from the Marine Corps will shoot fly-on-the-wall coverage for the ongoing battle for hearts and minds. In 1943, fearing the US population's enthusiasm for the war was waning, Roosevelt allows the use of censored footage from the Marines' invasion of Tarawa. With the help of Warner Brothers, the footage is made into a public information film.
With the Marines at Tarawa is graphic, but it's also groundbreaking. Because theater goers are directly, viscerally involved in the action.
This is the price we have to pay you for a war we didn't want. And before it's over, there'll be more dead on other battlefields.
That was deliberately to shock the American people into understanding that we are losing people in this war, and we are going to lose a great many more in order to achieve our objectives.
Over 3,000 Marines never leave that island. Included in that number are 2 of the cameramen who took that footage. That's how close up this footage is to the actual battle.
The film has the desired effect. It not only wins an Oscar in 1945, but support for the war increases. Marine cameramen are ready to roll again as the Corps prepared to storm Iwo Jima.
From the Marine Corps and the Navy perspective, the conditions are pretty ideal.
500 landing craft in 10 waves advance on 3,000 yards of beach. The ambition is to land 5,000 Marines in the first hour.
As the landing craft is approaching, here comes the rolling bombardment. This is something that the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps had perfected.
The Marines expect a firestorm from the Japanese. To their surprise, there's only light gunfire.
The problem starts as soon as they are ashore, because they now have to wade through this volcanic ash off the beach, and not just through a flat beach, but through a series of terraces that in some cases are up to 15 feet high.
A lot of these Marines are carrying up to 100 pounds of gear on them. It's extremely difficult going for them.
Most of their support weapons, tanks and armored Amtraks, aren't actually able to climb up these terraces. So you've got a situation that within minutes becomes quite serious.
The Marines are sitting ducks, but there's still no sign of enemy resistance.
Third wave hits, no fire. The Marines, who want to think pleasant thoughts anyway, are thinking, hey, this is it. We must be doing a good thing here. The naval bombardment must have worked.
For the Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, everything is going to plan.
General Kuribayashi was one of the most innovative tacticians, I would say, in the Japanese Army, and he combined a knowledge of the Americans, having lived in America for a couple of years as a military attaché. He knows how strong the Americans are when it comes to industrial power and how much firepower and specialized equipment they will bring to this invasion.
With the Japanese Navy decimated at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, and most of his aircraft on Iwo Jima withdrawn in defense of the home islands, Kuribayashi knows he's on his own.
What he decided to do, which was quite brilliant, was to not attempt to stop the invasion at the beaches, but to let the Americans come ashore.
Japanese have concealed the artillery in caves along the heights overlooking the beaches.
They let the first 20 or 30 minutes of the landing go forward until they had a large collection of Marines on these beaches, a very big target.
What happened next is described by a Marine radio reporter.
The beach that we're going to land on now looks to be very hot from here.
When the Japanese heavy guns start to open up on the beaches, it is absolute carnage.
We can't see it too well from our position here on this side of the superstructure, but we can see those gases from bursting mortar shells and artillery shells being tossed up in the air.
The Marines have been lured into a trap.
You've got this 650-foot volcano that literally has 1,000 fortified positions on it. And they're all overlooking your battle space.
Japanese have had plenty of time to mark the beaches and know the ranges, and they can hit with absolute precision on the first shot.
You can doubtlessly hear this gunfire going on all around us now. We are now inside the screen of warships. There's no more warships between us and the beach. We look out to the stern of us now, and there are hundreds of craft lying out there.
You're seeing men and machines blown into the air, landing craft being hit, burning, broaching, rolling onto the beach. There's no place at all to hide, and it's an absolute horror show.
As the water's being churned up quite a bit in between us and the beach now with the bursting of these shells.
And it was just chaos. I mean, it was utter hell.
The result of this bombardment is very, very heavy casualties amongst the invading Marines. There are many killed and wounded.
It must have been utterly terrifying for the Marines in those first few hours on the beaches, seeing men around them dropping and falling with appalling wounds and not actually being able to fire back at any of the enemy.
Over 3,500 Marines are killed or wounded in the first 48 hours of combat.
The result is that we have now made the initial down payment on the butcher's bill, and it's going to get heavier and heavier as this campaign goes on.
For the watching Navy Secretary James Forrestal, a PR disaster is looming.
And it was hard to keep the tragedy of Iwo Jima a secret at the time. I mean, there were about 75 war correspondents on the island. These were losses that were so heavy and so unexpected for such a relatively insignificant place that Roosevelt in the White House, when he heard of it, he wept.
The White House knows the timing couldn't be worse. The public's war hunger is continuing to wane. No longer anywhere near its level after the Japanese assault on Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor was widely seen as a stab in the back by the American citizenry. In fact, one of the most common visual motifs that you see during the war on the home front is a Japanese figure holding a bloody dagger.
War fervor was fueled by a torrent of anti-Japanese propaganda.
The Pacific War was very much a racist war. The average American during World War II had never met a Japanese person. And so they were very susceptible to propaganda that depicted the Japanese enemy as various sorts of cockroaches or vermin.
Support for the war is crucial for the US government, as morale translates into cash through the sale of war bonds.
Taxation only covered about 41% of the total cost of the war. The major part of the financing, about 59%, came from borrowing. And a lot of that borrowing was by individual Americans buying war bonds.
War bond sales are seen as a reliable barometer of morale. And as the Marines battle on Iwo, bond sales are falling.
The Allies are advancing on just about every front, and the Axis is in retreat. And in the Pacific, you see this sort of breathless coverage in the American press of the island hopping campaign, which features flag raising after flag raising each time the Marines take over an island. American civilians who are watching this coverage, there's this sense that victory is just around the corner.
On Iwo Jima, as the Marines try to take Mount Suribachi, a very different story is unfolding.
The Americans are faced with a real problem. Taking fire from all these concealed positions in the heights around Iwo Jima.
Suribachi is surrounded around its entire base with caves and other bunkers that all have to be reduced before you can even set foot on the hill itself. The Marines start moving up it bit by bit, blasting out the caves as they go up, all the way up to the top.
Our guns are quiet as they make the climb. We wait for a sign. Suribachi is ours.
On the 23rd of February, just 5 days into the battle, Old Glory is flying over Iwo Jima. The mountain's heavy guns that had cost so many lives are finally silenced.
Now you have something to cheer over, right? Well, holy cow, we did it. We took Mount Suribachi. It's ours.
The PR potential isn't lost on Navy Secretary James Forrestal.
For the purposes of public relations, we want to have a much larger flag, and as a result, there's a second flag raising that occurs after that that makes for a better photo op.
Press photographer Joe Rosenthal snaps away as the Marines celebrate. Two days later, his photo of the flag raising adorns the front page of almost every newspaper in America.
It's just one of those brilliant moments when composition and emotion all come together to tell a story just in one single photograph. It's a brilliant image.
But the triumphant photograph is masking the reality on the ground. The wounded are ferried back to waiting hospital ships in increasing numbers. Temporary cemeteries house the fallen. News of the casualties horrifies American public opinion.
There had been a lot of disclaimers in the media from moms and from the public saying, why are we losing all these people on this godforsaken island? You know, why are all these Marines dying?
James Forrestal's response to one anguished mother is unrepentant. On the 7th of December 1941, the Axis confronted us with a simple choice: fight or be overrun. There was then, and is now, no other possibility. The Japanese believe they can exploit the domestic discord to sue for peace.
The fundamental belief on the part of the Japanese leadership is that the American people are weak.
Although the American military power is enormous from a material standpoint, American morale is brittle.
The Americans are simply not going to be able to handle the mental stress of a large casualty roll coming back into the country. That is what they're betting all of their chips on.
A week into the battle, the Marines prepare to push north in their mission to secure the island. But precisely where the enemy is remains a mystery.
The Japanese aren't coming out to play, and so the Marines have to go and find them.
It's an absolutely terrifying feeling as you were pushing forward into enemy territory, not knowing when the enemy is going to open up on you.
The Marines risk making the same mistake twice.
Kurabayashi says, I will make my stand up in the northern end of the island where there's high ground and make them come to us.
As they advance, the Marines are hit by machine gun fire and heavy artillery from thousands of fortified bunkers, pillboxes, and caves.
It's impossible to approach any one bunker without coming under the fire from several other flanking fortifications as well.
Hit them with artillery, they hit them with bazookas, and they hit them with flamethrowers.
But the bombardment fails to suppress enemy fire.
Marines have become very dependent on tanks supporting them in trying to take out these very heavy defenses. The Japanese have exactly anticipated this. They have anti-tank guns sighted to blast these tanks, and there's very heavy losses of Marine tanks.
They've got to go step by step, winkling out the defenders from each position as they come to it, because most of these positions are underground. And it is a dreadful, slow-by-slow process that, of course, is going to cost a lot of Marine lives while they're at it.
Kuribayashi's soldiers are under no illusions as to what's expected of them.
The Field Service Code issued to the military in 1941 said, under no circumstances will you surrender.
Do not take the shame of being captured.
You literally have to fight to the death in your position. You're not allowed to die till you've killed 10 Americans. It's an order.
Their objective was to sell their lives dearly, to make the Americans pay as much as possible in blood and time to take Iwo Jima.
The Japanese know that the longer they can hold on to Iwo Jima, that buys more time for the defenses in Japan to be built up and perfected.
Kuribayashi has been drilling his troops on the island for months.
It's a classic sort of guerrilla strategy being pursued by the Japanese on this island.
The troops have learned to take deprivation and hardship in their stride.
They were beaten up all the time by the superiors, and they had to take it.
This was all part of a deliberate toughening up program so that when these guys were unleashed on the actual enemy, they would show very little mercy.
On Iwo Jima, it was limited rations, and there was no fresh water.
You also know that basically what you're doing is you're digging your grave. You talk about a combination of factors that would seemingly destroy morale of most combatants, but these are Japanese warriors.
A major drawback for the Marines is the absence of aerial information about Japanese troop positions.
There's a moment when an American pilot looks out of his plane and comments that one half of the island, the American half of the island, is crawling with movement, you know, trucks, jeeps, troops. The other half of the island has smoke from gunfire, but there's not a single Japanese person visible on that entire expanse.
The Americans remain unaware of Kuribayashi's defensive masterstroke.
Kurabayashi has connected most of these bastions with these underground tunnels.
The tunnels have protected Kuribayashi's forces from months of aerial and naval bombardment. And now they are a major weapon in his defense of the island.
When one of these positions is attacked, he can withdraw the garrison and the Marines are spraying flamethrowers into an empty bunker. And then once the Marines have cured that bunker and moved on to the next one, the Japanese go through the tunnel, reoccupy the bunker, and fire into the backs of the Marines that thought they just cleaned out that bunker.
The fortified honeycomb extends right across the island, connected by 11 miles of tunnels, linking Mount Suribachi in the south to Kuribayashi's command center in the north.
The forethought that was put into the Japanese positions on Iwo Jima was probably the pinnacle of achievement of the Imperial Army against U.S. forces in World War II.
On the 6th of March, U.S. newspapers are billing Iwo Jima as the most fortified island in the world. Over 2,050 Marines are now dead. When a stricken B-29 makes an emergency landing on its return from bombing Tokyo, it's a timely reminder of the invasion's original intent: to make Iwo Jima a fighter base to support US bombing raids. Like the battle for Iwo, the costly B-29's high-altitude bombing hasn't exactly gone to plan. They have yet to produce any strategic impact.
We learned a lot in those battles over Germany. We are still learning. But I assure you that what we have learned the hard way will be used to good advantage in the skies over Japan.
The head of the Army Air Forces, General Hap Arnold, has handed command of the superforts to Major General Curtis LeMay.
If you want to make an operation work, there is nobody in the Army Air Forces by 1944 who is better than Curtis LeMay.
LeMay studies mission reports and reconnaissance photographs from B-29 raids on Tokyo. And he realizes that Japan has almost no air defense left.
The Japanese don't have good night fighters. Their anti-aircraft guns are not radar directed. They don't have a centralized air command.
He also decides to do away with high explosive bombs and instead to use incendiaries. He's going to try to destroy cities instead of actually target munitions factories. And the first place, of course, he targets is Tokyo.
To ensure maximum accuracy, LeMay decides the raids should also take place at low altitude and at night to reduce casualties from enemy fire.
Most of the American pilots feel, in effect, it's going to be a suicide mission.
On the night of March 9th and 10th, even as the Marines are still fighting on Iwo Jima, a group of Pathfinder B-29s roars in over Tokyo and drops incendiary weapons in the form of a giant X in the heart of the city. And that is going to be the bombing point for the remainder of LeMay's force. For the next 2 hours, more than 200 B-29s come roaring in between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, releasing their bombs.
As predicted, the superforts meet little resistance, and conditions are perfect for firebombing. Tokyo is experiencing a very dry spell.
Most of the buildings are made of wood and paper, and it is absolutely perfect for an incendiary bomb.
That, combined with the very high winds that Tokyo is experiencing that night, means that very quickly you have this enormous conflagration. More than 1,500 tons of explosives are dropped on Tokyo and turns the entire city into a raging inferno.
Temperatures reach 1,800 degrees, sucking the oxygen out of the air, asphyxiating those not roasted to death.
It created a tornado like a fire today tornado.
16 square miles of the Japanese capital are destroyed.
It killed at least 80-some thousand people, probably more like 100,000 people.
These are greater numbers than were actually lost in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. And it wasn't just Tokyo. This was the start of a series of fire bombings of the major Japanese cities that would go on in the weeks to come.
All these raids are made without fighter escort, rendering the Army Air Force's original reason for taking Iwo Jima redundant.
The need was to get the airfields there to support the bombing campaign. The strategic bombing force had worked very successfully against Tokyo by flying at night, and it didn't really need, in that sense, fighter cover.
In the press, Iwo Jima's necessity as a fighter base is conveniently forgotten. The emphasis switches to its value as a safe haven for damaged and fuel-short B-29 bombers.
Over 2,000 landings are going to be made on Iwo Jima before the end of the war.
The Army Air Force argued that Iwo Jima saved more B-29 pilots than Marines were lost. There's no way that the lives lost on Iwo Jima were outweighed by the lives saved.
Whether you could ever argue that Iwo Jima needed to be captured, I don't think you could.
But the battle for the island rages on.
The single most depressing part of the battle was this. Because the Japanese positions were all underground, in caves or whatever here, Marines could see their casualties, they're dead, they're wounded, but they very seldom saw the dead Japanese, particularly lots of dead Japanese. And as many of them put it later, it was like they were not just fighting the Japanese, they were fighting the island itself.
Days are spent fighting over yards of barren terrain, all part of Kuribayashi's plan to bleed the Americans dry.
And he's just executing defense in depth at every step. And so even though you take over a Japanese position, the ones in front of you have all been pre-planned again, and you're starting over.
Poison gas is off the table, but the Marines improvise, smoking the Japanese out.
The end game in Iwo Jima is that General Kuribayashi and his few remaining surviving troops are shoved into the far north part of the island at a place called Bloody Gorge.
On the 17th of March, Kuribayashi contacts Imperial headquarters to say his troops are out of ammunition and water. He adds, now is the time to make the final counterattack. A few days later, the Japanese launch a suicidal raid on sleeping US servicemen.
Where the Japs came from was not known. Many wore GI equipment and carried American-made guns.
100 Americans are killed or wounded, but all 300 Japanese die.
It's essentially over at that point.
On the 26th of March, after 36 days of brutal fighting, the battle for Iwo Jima is over. Only about 3,000 of the estimated Japanese garrison of 21,000 survive. There are around 28,000 American casualties, 6,821 dead.
It's horrific. It's a horrific cost. It costs more than Guam, Tinian, and Saipan combined.
This is the first time in the war when American casualties, killed, wounded, missing, actually outnumber Japanese total casualties, which is a shocking surprise and not the kind of trend that you want to be carrying forward as you're thinking about an invasion of Japan itself.
As the Marines leave the island to prepare for their next battle, the call goes out for the men who raised the flag on Mount Suribachi. They are needed back home urgently. But 3 of the 6 Marines in Rosenthal's photograph, Michael Strank, Franklin Sousley, and Harlem Block, are dead. And the 3 survivors don't come forward.
For the Marines, it runs a little awkward. They're getting attention for the photo, not for what you're doing on Iwo Jima. None of them want to be recognized.
The photograph, taken on the 5th day of the battle, has become the standout image of the Pacific War.
It almost instantly gained a sense of national fame and even international fame. Yet that image is communicating a message inherently of victory around the corner that you don't want people to embrace yet.
The government fears the triumphant photo is reinforcing the public's complacency. It decides the best way to re-energize them is to manipulate the iconic image.
If you look at the primary poster of the 7th War Lone Drive, the Mighty 7th, they call it, it's made more dramatic if you look at the clouds. And the slogan of that poster says, "Now, all together." Your help is needed if we're going to get this flag up to its fully upright position so that we can finally declare victory.
Rene Gagnon, John Bradley, and Ira Hayes are eventually identified as the surviving flag raisers. Back home, they are given a hero's welcome as they join the morale-boosting bond drive across 33 cities.
It was something like a generation later when the Beatles came to the United States. In city after city, they were asked again and again to raise that flag, to pose for pictures, to pose for the newsreel cameras, and to do again what they had allegedly done on Mount Suribachi.
The hullabaloo masks an uncomfortable truth.
Of the 3 flag raisers brought back to the U.S. for the Mighty 7th War Bond Tour, Ira Hayes was actually the only one who we now know was in Rosenthal's photograph.
Ira Hayes is really forcefully saying, "I don't want to be part of this." And they order him to proceed and participate in the 7th War Bond campaign.
The tour raises $26 billion for the continuing war effort, far more than any previous Bond tour. There's no time to debate the horror of Iwo Jima or the futility of the battle. The government's eyes are now firmly focused on the planned invasion of Japan. 71 years later, Harold Schultz is finally revealed as one of the flag raisers. In 2019, Harold Keller becomes the last Marine to be identified.